Hi, in this video I'm going to show you a game that I played as black in the Calderdale Evening League against a player called Malcolm Corbett, who is still an active player now. So Malcolm opened with 1e4, which is his customary move, and I played 1e5. This game was played in 2002, and at this point in my sort of chess development I decided to learn to play the open games as black, having previously played the Sicilian exclusively. I just thought it's time now, I should really learn the open games, and I'd kind of been buoyed by looking at an old John Em's book called Play the Open Games with Black, an old Gambit chess publication, which is actually one of the first books that I owned on the open games for black. Now Malcolm played 2 bishop c4, which actually is quite a good move if you want to play the Italian game, which occurs after knight f3, knight c6, bishop c4. So 2 bishop c4 is quite a good way to get into these sort of positions for white, while avoiding the Petrov, which could occur after 2 knight f3, and also the Latvian gambit after f5, or the elephant gambit after d5, both which are quite tricky openings to face for white if you are not prepared. So in that sense, bishop c4 is a good way to get into the Italian game while avoiding these other sort of options. I then played 2 knight f6, which is probably the most common move in this position, but there are others such as knight c6. I think bishop c5 might even be an option as well. But I played knight f6, at which point Malcolm played knight f3, which is probably not the most common move here. Most bishop opening players would play something like 3 d3, or even 3 knight c3, which is a line of the Vienna. After a move like d3, white has prepared for the actual standard bishop's opening response, which is something like c6, where after knight f3, d5, we're in something very different to the Italian game there. So if you are going to play 2 bishop c4, you've got to be ready for these sort of moves as well. So after Malcolm played 2 knight f3, I indeed transposed back into the Italian game on this 2 knights variation now, with 3 knight c6. Now let's just go back and see what happens if black does indeed take the pawn. White now is really playing a gambit, and in this position white usually plays something like knight c3, and I found out that sort of the hard way against a very strong player, or very strong relative to myself, a player called Matthew Webb, and I played him on the internet over COVID, where there's obviously lots of online play, and I think I played him in one of these sort of local sort of Bradford Chess Club tournaments, and I played this as black, and he showed me some of the pitfalls. So after knight takes, pawn takes, black now, the best move is f6. The issue is after moves like either d6 or knight c6, white would answer with knight g5, and white is already seriously better there, because there is no good way to prevent the attack on f7 after either 5 knight c6 or after 5 d6. No good way to prevent the attack on f7. But even after f6, after say castles, even now there are potential sort of minefields to avoid. For example, move like c6, hoping to prepare d5. Again, that runs, I think this is what I played against Matthew Webb, but it runs into, which now looks very obvious to me, knight takes e5. And obviously if you take back, queen h5 check is game over. So yes, there are pitfalls to avoid. I think after f6 castles, knight c6 is probably the best move. White then usually plays knight h4. Black would play, say, g6 to prevent the knight coming into f5. White may then play f4, and I think after f5, black is doing okay. But you can appreciate for somebody like myself who'd only just started playing e5 for black, that's potential knowledge that an inexperienced player of black with these positions may potentially fall into some of these pitfalls. So yes, theory may say that this knight takes e4, which is the position after move 3, knight takes e4. This is probably better for, it's probably not great for white, theoretically, but practically, black has to avoid a few minefields. Hence, that's why I played knight c6, which is now a standard 2 knights, which usually occurs via the 2 knight f3, knight c6, 3 bishop c4 move order. White now has options. Malcolm opted for knight g5, probably the most aggressive move, but obviously you can play d3 when black can go into a Gucco pianissimo with bishop c5, or keep things in 2 knights territory with 4 bishop e7, or a move like 4 h6. After 3 knight c6, white can also play a move like d4. Black usually takes, and then white's got a couple of choices. Let's just say that white can then say castle, then bishop c5 would instigate potentially the Max Lang attack, which is again an opening that you've got to kind of know what you're doing a little bit. You can't just kind of make it up as you go along. Rather than bishop c5, knight takes e4 is a move that I've played quite a bit, and play usually goes rook e1, d5, bishop takes, queen takes, knight c3. Black then has a decision of where to put the queen, so queen a5 is an option, queen h5, queen d7, they're kind of the main options. I tend to find, though, when I've played these games online and over the board, they end up being quite a dry, symmetrical positions once black's d4 pawn disappears. So, as is the case with lots of these e5 lines, it can end up being quite hard to play for a win. Max Lang attack may be the best way to unbalance, but theoretically black is doing fine here. Obviously, after after e takes d4, white obviously has the option to play e5, which is another big main line that a 2 knights player has to be ready for. Usually in this position, black would play something like d5, bishop b5, and then bishop c5 is an option. But obviously we divulging, but it's just the sort of things that a 2 knights player as black needs to be ready for all these potential sidelines. But Malcolm played for knight g5, which again is probably the most aggressive move. Now black has options. I played in the game for d5, which is probably the most common move, but there is a very interesting alternative which probably most people will be aware of, and that is this wild variation called the Traxler or Wilkes bar. White then has to choose what to do, and there are 3 kind of main accepted moves. Bishop takes f7 is one of them. Knight takes f7 is another. But actually, I think I ended up reading somewhere that this move 5d4 is actually supposed to theoretically the best line for white, and from what I understand, it gives black, after all the correct moves are played, black ends up in a bit of a miserable ending where white's got or black has very few winning chances, and white's the only one who's got a good chances to win. Just to give you an example of what can happen in this wild variation, I had a game against Dave Shapland, an old Hebden Bridge club colleague, back in 2014 in a, must be said, a very informal sort of lightning tournament, 10-second move. Dave is a better player than me, and he's got a positive record, but I did manage to beat him on this occasion in this line where I was black, and he played knight takes f7. It must be said Dave rarely played knight g5 on move 4. He was normally played something like 4d4. Now in this position, black should play bishop takes f2. White can take this bishop, and it is an option, but Dave decided to play king f1. Obviously, black's queen's attacked, so now he moves to e7, I move to e7. White then takes the booty on offer and plays knight takes h8. In this position, it's all about activity. Obviously, black is massive material down, and he's got to play active. And the best move is to play d5, which opens up the diagonal for the light squared bishop on c8. White then took the pawn, and obviously now the knight's attacked, so black then plays knight d4. White attacks the knight on d4. Black ignores it and plays bishop g4 to attack the queen. The queen then gives check, and the knight on f6 defends or blocks, the check. Black's now going to lose another piece, and he does. He plays c takes d4. But now actually, believe it or not, even though black is all this material down, black is probably winning this position after queen f6. It's actually almost impossible to get out of this. Dave played bishop e2, at which point I played bishop d4 check. I will show you the game very quickly, and I will say that neither of us probably played this the best. We only had 10 seconds a move for this. So I'll just play through the game. So again, there are probably better moves than this. It's quite amusing where the king ends up in this game. So now the queen's is going to be sacrificed. Knight d3 check. And then the king's moved all the way from e1 to a6, and obviously bishop c8 check is checkmate. And that was a game that's played by myself and Dave Shapland. I will say that Dave is a far higher rated player than me. He's around 2,000, or has been around 2,000 recently, and has a plus record. I have beat him sometimes, but he's certainly got better of me more than I've got the better of him. But that was one quite amusing game that we played. But it just shows you an interesting line in this sort of two knights after 4 knight g5 that again you could investigate in your own time. I played d5, which is probably the most sensible move. I think it's probably the best way to describe it. It's theoretically sound. Now, white nearly always plays e takes d5. Now black is at a crossroads of what to do. There is many sort of defences here for black. One that I have never played and probably never would is knight takes d5, and I think this instigates the fried liver attack where white can play knight takes f7, and I think black needs to walk a very tight, very sort of walk a tightrope to survive, but I think probably can. I think the best move is actually supposed to be d4 in this position, but it's an opening that I know very little about. I know openings quite well, but this is not one that I know very much about at all, so I'm not going to pretend that I do. Another option would be something like knight d4, which I think is like the Fritz variation. I think b5 is another one where I think white best move is bishop f1. I think this is called the Ulvsted variation. But there's lots of ways to defend against this kind of knight g5 move. The move that I ended up playing was, again, probably the most popular, which is knight a5. I'm just going to promote this. So knight a5 is the move. At which point white nearly always plays bishop b5 check. I defended with c6, although it must be said, I think bishop d7 is probably a decent enough move as well. But after c6, white again nearly always takes the pawn. And again, black takes the pawn. Now again, we're at a little bit of a crossroads of what to do. White's got probably a choice of 3 moves here. And the move that Malcolm actually played was bishop e2. But it must be said that white could play, say, queen f3. At which point, I think one sort of defence of black would be, say, bishop e7, bishop takes, knight takes, queen takes, check, bishop d7. And again, black is material down. I think this is a common theme in these knight g5 lines. Black is material down, but has lots of activity, big lead in development, and that compensates for this kind of material deficit. So after this move, white could also play bishop d3, which is again I think probably the more modern main line. But Malcolm played bishop e2, at which point black nearly always drives the knight away, and Malcolm played knight f3. Knight h3 is a move as well, which has been played by people like Bobby Fischer. But after knight f3, again, black nearly always attacks the knight again, at which point the knight goes to e5. It must be said that I actually have had a game as black where somebody played the knight back to g1. I think a guy called Steve Priest, who used to play in the Coldale League. And again, you can just looking at the position, you know, white has literally got bishop on e2 and black's got knight out, both diagonals open for his bishop. You know, he's a classic example of material versus activity. But Malcolm played the best move, or undoubtedly the best move, which is knight e5, at which point I played bishop d6, which is fine. Bishop c5 is also a move, and again, I don't think there's any clear consensus to which is the best bishop move, but I played bishop d6 anyway. This is where, and this is all absolute mainline theory. You find it in many, many chess books for black or with the two knights defence. Malcolm now played probably his first, he may be out of theory now, because he played an unusual move, knight g4, which again is well, it's not the best. Mainline here would be something like d4 or even f4, I think. So after d4, take en passant, knight takes, castles, queen c7, h3, c5, and again, black's got a lot of activity for the pawn. That's kind of what I was expecting. Even back then, I was familiar with kind of that position, and then, you know, obviously got to use the activity there to compensate for the material deficit. But after knight g4, I think this gives black an easier time of it. I don't think it's the best move. So obviously, black's just going to continue developing, and as white does, white plays knight c3, and again I want to play rook e8. Again, defend the pawn on e4, and again potentially look to move the rook, a rook lift, as you'll see later on, a rook lift to the king's side. White then castled, which again is potentially very logical, at which point I then played knight takes g4. Obviously, white had to take back with a bishop, and now we introduce quite obviously a huge threat of mating 1 on h2, but also the additional threat of hitting the bishop on g4. And you can see now that black's pieces are kind of really closing in. White has still not even got his diagonal open for his c1 bishop, and black has literally got a lot of his pieces in play. Both diagonals open for the bishop, the rook's on an open file. Again, big lead in development there. White plays h3 to defend the dual threat of the bishop on g4 and the mate on h2. Black then hits the bishop and plays f5. Now, I think what Malcolm played then is bishop e2. I think it turns out that bishop h5 is a little bit better, but possibly not an obvious move. Possibly not as obvious as bishop e2, which is what Malcolm played. After bishop e2, we do introduce what we mentioned earlier on, the rook lift. The rook is going to come to g6 and introduce the not very subtle threat of something like queen takes h3. Malcolm then played probably the losing move now, which is d4. Again, I believe that something like bishop h5 may be the best move here. But again, I think this is practically very hard to play, and it's not unusual that Malcolm wants to develop his bishop, stake a claim in the centre. But after rook g6, White's got practically an impossible defence now. He obviously moves his king now to escape the threat of queen takes h3, but after f4, opening the diagonal for the c8 bishop, this position is ultimately lost. So White actually took on e4 in this position, but after bishop takes h3, the game obviously is over. Malcolm did play g3 in this position, and obviously bishop takes, queen takes his mate. But even after g3, f takes g3 is resignable, and Malcolm did indeed resign this position. So a very, very pleasing game for me at the time. Again, Malcolm is a player of probably of a similar level to me, similar rating to me, and he has got the better of me on a number of occasions as well. We've kind of beat each other before, but this is why it's particularly a pleasing game, because Malcolm is a good player. Hopefully you've found the intricacies of the two knights very interesting. It was my favourite opening for quite some time, and hopefully I can show you another game soon.